Yo everyone, hope you're all well. Thought I'd do a little bit of a run through of this photo that Chelsea submitted last month to our Facebook page. There's a photo she took, and I was going to go through what I did to sort of end up with this result here. Start off with, I want to just talk about something that I do, which is pre-visualizing photos. So usually I do it in the field when I'm out there taking my photo. I'm looking at the scene and I'm getting a picture in my mind of how that final image will look, whether it's, what we capture in the camera is often different to what our final image will actually look like. So I like to visualize sort of what processing steps I might even be doing when I get home to the computer to get that end result that I'm looking for. So I think digital photography these days is a two-step process. One step is taking the photo, getting that right light, getting those compositions, getting all that sort of stuff, and getting a good exposure to work on, so that when we get back to the computer, that the processing is done with a file that has all the information we need to get that final result that I've pre-visualized while I'm out in the field. It's a bit different when we're working with someone else's photos. Obviously I wasn't there when Chelsea took this photo, so I didn't pre-visualize something. So I'm going to look at the raw file and I'll sit there for a little while. I've processed it once before, and I came and I went through, what would I've been seeing while I was there? How would it look to my eyes? And try to imagine how I would have seen that scene, nice, while I was there, and how I would like it to be processed. So as we've been learning every month, everyone has a different take on the photo, how they pre-visualize it and come up with a result. Sometimes it is you just start playing with the image and you come up with something as you're playing with it and you go, oh, that's a nice track, I might go down that track. So in the case of this one, I was looking at the scene and imagining it being a misty morning, sun's just peeking over the top of the cliffs, and there's a lot of that filtered foggy light coming through, where the sun's also warm still, as in like that golden hour time of the day. And we've filled the forest with sort of a nice light fog, but there's still plenty of detail in the foreground. Obviously our before photo, while it looks very dark, it's actually really well exposed. If we just pop into Camera Raw, by the way, Camera Raw, Lightroom, whichever one you like, doesn't matter. They both process the images exactly the same way. Lightroom just organizes these tabs in a different way. So I had them all here in Camera Raw. Just along the top, I can click on each one of them to open up each of the different ones, whereas Lightroom's just sort of a long line that you scroll down through and expand the tabs. I just find this an easier workflow for me. As we can see from the histogram, Chelsea's done a great exposure. Look, we've got basically nothing clipping the edge here, so even these lightest parts here where it's super bright, we still have detail heading all the way down to the shadows, and there's not really anything being clipped there, so there's just a little bit of pure blacks probably just right down here in the foreground. So we have all the detail from the scene. Even though it looks dark, it's a great exposure because we have all that detail to play with. Now, I like to start by doing my lens corrections first. So we pop over to the lens corrections tab, just hit automatically remove those aberrations and the lens profiles. So we can see that it was Chelsea used a 24-105 Sigma lens, and it's pretty much fixed up all of those things. The vignetting, probably a bit much for me. It corrects out, if you have a look before and after, it corrects a lot of vignetting out. You can see it up here in that corner particularly. So I like to just dial that back a bit, probably around that 50% mark. So that's our corrections. The next step I like to do is just sort out the vertical lines in the picture. I'm a bit of a stickler for having straight lines in a photo. My vertical's vertical, my horizontal's horizontal. It's just who I am. I believe Chelsea took this handheld. Taking a handheld photo is almost impossible to get, your horizons straight and your lines vertical. So this is just a step that I usually do second. So in this case, I already done this, I won't save a bit of time, but with the verticals, it was just straighten them up a little bit to, I think it was -15 odd. The rotation was pretty good. Now aspect ratio, which is, I find that sometimes the lenses squash an image. So with that, I can then see how we can, wide angle lenses often squash an image that way. So I like to add, depending on the scene, just squash it back the other way again. And then we can just scale it a little bit to sort of remove a little bit of those white lines. And then we can also move the offsets. So we just move that way a little bit and down with that one. There we are. I'm not too worried about these white areas here because I did just remove or clone them in Photoshop. If you weren't going to do the next step and go to Photoshop, you might just have to crop it. But I didn't want to lose, see how we got this nice sun star at the top here? I didn't want to lose that. So I chose to leave them there and then clone them later so that I could get as much of these rays from that sun star in the corner. This is now looking good. Just got to hit the hand tool to get back to my tabs. And we start doing some of that processing. Now, as I was saying, I felt like this was a warmer morning light, so I just sort of went with a nice warm color, probably a little bit less of the red, magenta. And then we've got to start playing. Obviously it's a bit dark for our image, so we're going to just start ramping up the exposure a little bit. Now, I'm looking more at this area up here for what I'm doing now with all my global adjustments with exposure, contrast, etc. Whereas I'll use gradients, etc. to fix up or lighten further the foreground and maybe even darken the sky a little bit. Add a little bit of contrast to our scene. Being hazy, needs a little bit more contrast. We can pull back some of those highlights in the sky. And push up those shadows a little. As you can see, we're now starting to get some of those foreground coming back as well. And I'll leave the whites and the blacks as they are. As you can see, we're just clipping a little bit of white, which would be up here in the bright sun, which is fine. And we don't have any, we've got the histogram hitting the edge there basically, so we don't need to add any black point in. This new feature of texture, it's nice. It adds a bit of, a bit more texture to all this. It's like a micro contrast. It adds contrast around all of these fine details. Clarity being, a bit more, as you can see, we're just cutting through that haze a little bit. And we've got this feature, dehaze. Sometimes if you're having a really hazy day, you could really cut through the haze and you can see you can bump it up, but it looks a bit too much if you go too far. So I like to keep it fairly subtle. And I think in this case, we'll just stick it around just 3, just to add a little bit of extra. What it basically dehaze is doing is it's making the shadows and the blacks, it's making them darker, it's making the lighter colors lighter, and it's adding also a little bit of saturation to the image as well. Now I'm just going to add some vibrance. It adds saturation to colors that aren't so saturated yet, while adding only a little bit of saturation to already saturated colors. Whereas saturation just adds the same amount of saturation to everything. So you can be a bit more generous with the vibrance. And just because it's a raw file, it hasn't had any color put into it yet, we can saturate it a bit as well, just to give it a punch. And as you can see, with these adjustments we've done so far, we've made quite a bit of a difference to our image. I'm really starting to like this area here, where we have the light filtering through the fog and the trees are coming up. foreground's still a bit dark, but that's okay. We'll get back to that soon. And jump across to our hue, saturation and luminance slider. This is where we can play with particular colours. We can change their hues, their saturation and their brightness basically. In this case, I wanted to just change the yellows a little, make them a little bit oranger. Just a little bit like that. And then our greens. Greens on cameras often go a bit yellowy murky, and if you want those nicer greens, you can just change them a bit like that. To do a bit of, see if you can notice before, after. No, it's very hard to see. Probably especially on the screen recording, but yeah, these greens are a bit more green now, and I've made these warmer colours a little bit oranger. Now I'm going to selectively pump up a bit of saturation in the oranges, just so that this area here is getting a bit more colour to it, saturation. Same with the yellows a bit.
Go ahead.
Thanks Siri for popping up. With the aquas, that's these sort of in the sky colours, I'm going to tone them down a little bit. And a little bit with the blues too. They're just getting a bit strong, especially in these shadow areas here. You see before, and then after. Again, it's a bit subtle, but it's there. If you wanted to, luminance is a good way. Say we wanted to darken the sky, we could just pull back the blues, see that? Or lighten them. It's a good way to do that, but I think in this case I'll just leave that, maybe slightly, and I'll work with that more with gradients. Just wanted to slightly fine tune the contrast using curves, so we can grab 2 points. There we go. Just a little bit like that. If you have a look at before, after, you know, made it a bit more punchy through here. Now we'll get onto those gradients. Everything we've done was global, now we're going to do some local adjustments with the gradient. Hit our gradient tool up here, and then we start a gradient and keep going till we want to finish our gradient. So in this case, sort of on the go up sort of to here. There we'll just, everything before the green line is going to be the full effect of what we change here in our exposure, etc., and it tapers off through here. So by having a long stretch like this, we're having a nice tapered off effect. This is our first one here. Just was going to bump up the exposure a bit, add a bit more contrast, pull back the highlights a little, because we don't want these highlights here losing these nice reflections through here. And then of course we're going to bump up those shadows just a bit like this. Don't want to go too far where it starts looking unrealistic. I like to process all my images. They look like a real scene. I don't want it to look HDR, I don't want it to look over processed. I'm trying to make it look like it's a real scene out there. Add a little bit of clarity, maybe just a little bit. And with the dehaze slider, I think we'll cut back a little bit of that. So we see we're reducing that contrast overall using the dehaze slider. Not too far, just a bit. And it sort of softens it up. The last thing I think I want to do is it's looking a bit cool down here, so I'll add just a little bit of extra warmth to the foreground. So that's done nicely. I think I like the way this has worked, but I still reckon this area here is a bit dark. There's a little bit more we could pull out of these grasses here in the foreground. So we'll get a new gradient. Just through there. In Adobe Camera Raw, it remembers the last settings you used. I do believe in Lightroom it resets to 0. It can be an advantage or a disadvantage. I'd rather the grasses right at the front be a bit cooler. We certainly don't want it too warm. So we're going to pump up the exposure. We'll leave the contrast and the but we'll get rid of that highlights back to 0. Double clicking on the little triangle will bring it back to the 0 point. And we'll bring back put some blacks into it like that. I like to add a little bit of texture, just to give more detail in those grasses in the foreground. And we'll bring back that dehaze to 0. Now as you can see, it's affecting all the tones in here, not just the dark areas. So I did a range mask as well. The range mask, we can click luminance, and you'll see from black to white. And when we drag these sliders, so I drag this one here, it'll stop affecting, it'll only affect the tones between the two sliders. So in this case, when I drag this down to 35, which is what I had, only blacks through to very dark greys will be affected by this mask, this gradient. We can see that by, if we click the mask, the areas in dark red are the areas that are being affected. As you can see here, it's not affecting these things. So if I pull this back up to white again, you can see it's affecting all this. And if I bring this down, you can see they disappear. And those clear areas are not being affected by the mask, and I'm only now adding these adjustments to those shadow areas. And we can turn that mask off so we can see our image. Next, we're going to add a new gradient. And you can see our sky is a little light and we haven't got a lot of detail coming through on these mountains in the background. I'm going to grab a gradient, bring it through here. Something like this. And this time we're going the other way with it. Going to remove or make it darker. Pull back some of the highlights. We'll actually pump up the shadows a bit because I want these darker tones that are in the foreground here to come out a little bit. Don't need that black there. And I actually wanted to warm this up a little bit, this light. A warmer light, but not so magenta-y, so pull some of that magenta out of there as well. That's looking pretty good. Might add some clarity. Don't need any texture here in this one. And we'll dehaze that a little as well. Just a little. So as you can see now with our 3 gradients we got here, before gradients and after, you can see we're having quite an effect on the image. I really like what's going on here with the light.
One possibility I see nearby is Hummingbird on Rosamond Road in Curribanong.
What you shouldn't do is have your iPads and your iPhone in the room where Siri seems to pick up on pretty much anything that sounds anything like Siri and start talking.
Yes.
See? Yes.
I'm not sure I...
Alright, next, the sky was looking a bit yellow up here. So we'll pump through another gradient just for this top part of the sky. Probably just through here. And I'll just reset some of these parameters because they get a bit, it's hard to see what you're doing when they're all still set from last time. And what we want to do is I wanted to get that top of the sky there much bluer. So we're going to really bring back our temp. Kill a bit more of that yellow that's in there, magenta that's in there. So now we've blued up that top part of the sky. Just darken it a tad. Finally, I decided to also just add a couple of areas using our radial adjustment tool. Just specifically through this area through here. So you can adjust it up through here a little. So what we're doing here, just want to add a little bit more brightness just to this shadow area. And just warm it up a little. It's gone a bit blue, I find. And we'll just lower the contrast. We're losing that sort of foggy feel. Bring back the highlights and the shadows a tiny bit. There we go. Actually, we might just dehaze it a little bit. There we go. Now we're getting back that foggy feel. I actually want this effect not just be on the radio, but just come through here too. So I can use the brush tool, go to the add brush, adjust the size of my brush using the bracket key, but you can use size there, and just add this sort of through this area too a little, just through here. We can look at before and after on that too. Before, after. It gives that sort of that impression of the fog back again that we were losing a little bit through there. Finally, just one more radial tool, because I just feel like this water here could just do with a little bit of adjusting. Really just all I want to do is just no colour, a little bit of exposure. Just to those brightest areas. Reset those ones, reset that one. There we go. So we just those sort of this nice specular stuff going along the top here. Fix that up a little bit. Now I just wanted to go back to this gradient, the one where we blued up the sky. I feel like it's doing too much to the top of the mountain here. So we're going to use that masking tool again. But this time we're going to go the other way. Just stop it affecting the mountain so much. So we look at our mask, bring it in a bit. There we go. So now we're just affecting the sky. And that brings it to the end of what I did in Lightroom. I did actually do a little bit of spotting. As you can see, there's some spots. Bit of a dirty sensor, as you can see there's lots of spots. You can run through with the spot tool, make it click, and then it automatically chooses a spot to get rid of that spot. But I won't run through that now, there's quite a lot of those. One last thing I did do though was, if we go back to our thing, was a bit of sharpening. It's best to look at sharpening at 100%, so we can see our trees and stuff. So usually I like to add somewhere in that vicinity of 60 to 70 to 80 in that area. Bit of a radius, 1 to 1.5, depends. There's a bit of noise in this, so we might pull a bit of noise out. Add a tiny bit more of the detail. And with masking, it protects areas of the image from being sharpened. So like the higher you go with the masking, you can start cutting out noise in flat areas of color and stuff. So if you hold down the Alt key while you drag that slider, you will see the areas in black are not being sharpened and the white areas are being sharpened. You can see that the mountainside and the sky is not going to get sharpened, but just the trees and the sort of the textures in the image. Somewhere around here looks good. As you saw, I just show you again when I click the masking, that see the sky is not getting sharpened, but it also helps you see those dust spots. Awesome. And that was about it. Then I went into Photoshop, but that's for another day. Thank you very much for watching that. Hopefully it wasn't too long and too boring and you got through it all. That was a pretty complicated image to process. It took me a good, I think, 20 minutes while I was doing it quickly, messing around with things, coming up with a visualization, that sort of thing. Probably took me a bit longer with that, sort of going through the steps, explaining what I was doing at the time. But yeah, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video, I guess. I don't know. We'll see.